Hi, I'm Adam Natali, Director of SVA Theater at the School of Visual Arts. If you've never heard of SVA, we're a preeminent art and design college in New York City. Check the description below for more info. Since 2014, SVA Theater has hosted After School Special, the college's annual alumni film and animation festival. The festival is normally a series of free screenings followed by Q&As with alumni who are successfully working in the film industry. Even though we're unable to host in-person screenings this year, we're thrilled to be able to present interviews with over 25 alumni who've worked on a wide variety of feature films, television shows, documentaries, animated films, and more. Whether tonight's Q&A focuses on a particular series, film, or other work, we'll be sure to note it in the description below and will provide info on how to watch. All of our festival interviews will premiere here on YouTube during the week of September 21st. We're calling this our work from home edition of After School Special, and our guests are zooming in from all over the world, from Singapore and Germany to Canada and California. A full schedule of After School Special 2020 interviews can be found at svatheater.com, but all videos will remain on YouTube following their premieres. I hope you enjoyed tonight's interview, and if you're interested in viewing past After School Special Q&As, you can visit the School of Visual Arts' YouTube channel. Thanks for tuning in, and fingers crossed, we hope to see you in person at an SVA Theater event in the near future. Hi, I'd like to welcome Martin Ahlgren, a 2000 graduate of SVA's BFA film program. Martin has been making movies since he was a teenager in Sweden with a Hi8 video camera and with friends willing to be splattered in ketchup. His time at SVA led to his start in commercials and music videos. After spending a decade working on campaigns for major brands all over the world and on music videos for artists such as the Rolling Stones, Beyonce, and Kanye West, he moved into longer form storytelling with independent features and television. His credits include the Netflix shows Altered Carbon, House of Cards, and Daredevil, Power on Stars, and the pilot episodes of NBC's Blind Spot and AMC's Nosferatu. His most recent project was the HBO miniseries The Plot Against America, which garnered Martin his second Emmy nomination. So I'm thrilled to welcome Martin here tonight, who's calling in from Singapore. It's nighttime where we are, it's daytime where you are. So thank you for being here and welcome.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you for staying up late to let me do this at daytime.
Not a problem for us. So I'd first love to hear about your experience at SVA in our undergraduate film program, and knowing that you're originally from Sweden, how did you find your way across the pond?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to, I did a film course in Sweden. I did cinema studies at the university, but somehow I sort of always felt that if I really wanted to work in film, I had to make it to the US. I mean, I kind of thought that I needed to go maybe to California, but as I was starting to research schools, I landed on SVA, and I was able to transfer some credits over. So I started a couple of semesters in. It still took me 4 years to finish. I wasn't very fast, but yeah. So that's how I landed at SVA. Yeah, and then once there, I found it to be an extremely creative environment. I think there's a few different aspects to being a school. One is, of course, the school itself, the facilities, the equipment you have access to, and then you have your teachers, and sort of like the mentors that you end up a lot of times, and as I have worked with even after you leave school, to kind of call up on for advice and stuff like that. And then you have the students that you're there with, and that was really something that I thought was great at SVA. It was just like such a great creative community and a really good environment to be in.
Can you tell us a little bit about your thesis film, if you have some fond memories of that?
Yeah, so I mean, I went to school for cinematography, which meant that I didn't do my own thesis film. I don't know if it's the same now, but at my time it was like you did you shot 2 thesis films for other directors, and that was sort of like what you did. Now, because I kept repeating semesters a little bit, like because I had transfer credits, but then I didn't do so many credits each semester and stuff like that. So I actually did a few thesis films in the last 2 years that I was there. I think over the course of being at SVA, I probably shot something like 25 short films or something like that, and a few of those being thesis films. But the most ambitious we did was a film directed by a student called Michael Scherer, and it was a fairly ambitious project. We actually took over what was then was, I think it was 604 was the studio, and it was like an open studio space, and we actually built an entire diner inside of that studio space. When I've been to the school now, there's some set pieces there, but it was kind of like an empty bare space when we were there. We built an entire diner and shot during the summer before school started, so that we would be able to do that. And I think did something like a 3-week shoot or something like that. It was an ambitious project, and it actually ended up winning a Student Academy Award for experimental short film. So which was tremendous. But yeah.
That's great. And how did you decide to sort of track into cinematography as opposed to directing or any other, film track?
Yeah, I mean, I like most people imagined that I wanted to be a director when I was starting out, and I was doing short films. I did a short film in Sweden when I went to the film course there, that I traveled around with to some festivals and stuff like that, and had a great experience with. But I was also noticing that I was becoming more and more interested in the visual side of the storytelling, and the films I was making was definitely more kind of like visually driven, and when I moved to New York, I kind of made the decision that, okay, now I'm gonna specifically focus on doing cinematography, and just by deciding that, it kind of narrowed everything down a little bit, because it became more like, okay, so now meeting someone who's doing a short film, we can immediately start talking about working together and collaborating on that. And one of the things that I found was that I really enjoyed the collaboration between cinematographer and director, and that's sort of been something that's stuck with me throughout my whole career. I've dabbled in going back to directing. Usually it's been like commercials and stuff like that. But I've really found that like the creative partnership that I have with a director is something that I've been gravitating to and enjoy still. And so, yeah.
So that's something I've actually always wondered about cinematographers and how they're hired. Especially as you've worked on, several television shows, is it usually a director who's doing the hiring, saying, they really like working with you? Is it a production company or a studio? Where is the sort of networking and connection that gets you from job to job?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely feel like my closest collaborator and the person who I sort of in a way assume is the person who's hiring me is always the director. I feel like my allegiance is always with the director, whatever happens. Now, television is a little bit different because it's not really a director-led medium, even though you have some great directors working in it, but it's still, at its core, it's sort of like a medium that's kind of run by like a head writer and the producers, they're running that. So, and the directors are a little bit more transient. They come in for specific episodes, or they might set up the pilot and things like that. And now, especially that TV has gotten a little bit more larger in scale, they attract big time directors that come in and expect to have a lot of say creatively. But at its core, it's like, over the course of seasons, it's usually not a director that's the consistency there. So in TV, I find that any job I've done in TV has to some extent been through recommendations, or at least kind of like affirmations from producers. So you know, and sometimes maybe that can even land you in a little bit of trouble when you're too, like I really like to get into the director's head and understand what it is that they want to do. I feel like that's a big part of my job, and part of what makes it exciting. If I feel like there's if the director has an interesting perspective, then part of the creativity for me is coming out of like interpreting what that means in visual terms or technical terms and things like that. And sometimes if you're on a TV show and a director comes in and want to stir things up a little bit, I sometimes think that can be healthy and it can be kind of good, but it can also then encounter some resistance from the establishment of the show. And it certainly has gotten me in trouble a few times when I've been like too sort of like loyal to the director in a sense, and to the vision of the director, when there's other forces at play. But so you have to find a balance with that. But I think that as much as TV needs the consistency of like the head creatives, it is a cinematic medium, and I think that usually the directors that come on are when it comes to the top creative people on the show, the ones that have the most sort of like cinematic vision. Like, you know, a lot of times there's some great writers, but a lot of times it still is coming from a writing perspective and not from a filmmaking perspective.
Sure. I'd like to show we have some photos of several of your shows that you've worked on, as well as some music videos and commercials. So I'd love for you to go through those and tell us, you know, a little bit about those, each of those pieces and photos.
Sure. Yeah. So this is from Kanye West's music video Power. It was directed by a video artist named Marco Brambilla, who started out young as a filmmaker. I think he directed Demolition Man when he was like 27 or something like that, and had very early success, but swore off commercial filmmaking and became more of a very specific visual arts artist. And so I've worked with him quite a few times, and so this was one of his more commercial projects, which was a music video for Kanye West. Obviously, we know who this is. The funny thing about this video, I would say, is that you know, obviously this is a huge star, platinum, and you know, there's you know, hard to get much bigger than that when it comes to music. But the way the industry is today is that when we did this video, which now is, I don't know, 6-7 years ago or something like that, the budget was still such that we basically were shooting her in a small studio against a black background with just a few props and a high-speed camera, and that was the extent of the video. You know, if you contrast that to what music videos was like in, say, the year 2000, when they routinely were $1 million each, and that wasn't anything unusual. It's the music industry and the way music videos are made is very different these days. Doesn't mean that they necessarily are less interesting. They can certainly be very creative and have an interesting concept at its core as well. But it still is a different story. Like she, instead of she put up the money herself for the video, and sort of like we made something very simple in one shoot day. This is for the Saturday Night Live crew. And that surprisingly had a better budget. We actually shot for 3 days, and you know, it's a fun, good atmosphere when you're working with people, but that do comedy. But one thing that you know, and when I work with comedians, one thing that really always strikes me is that somehow they seem to be, of all the people that I work with, the most focused and the most dedicated to the work, and I think that speaks something to how difficult comedy really is, and that it takes a lot of effort to get it right, and it's not as easy as what you hope the image eventually will look like.
And was that top of Rock Center that we were saying? This
is top of MetLife, actually. It recently just opened up. We built a platform on it so that we didn't have the railing behind them, so you can see that there's the building railing is sort of like a little further back, and by putting them up on scaffolding, we were able to shoot them just against the backdrop there. Extremely cold day. Yeah, it was.
Give me a fear of heights too. So.
Yeah. So now we're into commercials. This is classic Budweiser commercial, and there might be a still of that as well. But one thing that I've sort of had as a side specialty is a little bit, and I sort of just by accident more or less came into it, is shooting high-speed liquids. So and it's its own little world. You're in this macro environment, and it's kind of all about lighting in a way. But it drives you nuts because it's tedious and difficult to work with, and everything is so small. But in a way, it's also entirely focused only on lighting. So it's as a cinematographer, it can still be fun. So obviously Kobe Bryant, who tragically passed away just over a year ago. This spot I actually directed, and it's one of those where it came in as an opportunity, and I didn't want to pass on it. I had a good time. It was certainly working with him was quite inspiring, because even though we only had him, for a shoot day, and not even a full shoot day, like a few hours, he was extremely dedicated to what we were doing when we were in it, and until he was pulled away by his people saying that time's up, kind of. But yeah, it's always impressive when you work with people who obviously have a very dedicated focus, and regardless of what they're doing, even if you're doing a silly commercial like this. Another commercial for Under Armour, with a director that I work with a lot, Noah Konopask. And here we get into some of the TV work. So this is the opening of the show Altered Carbon, which takes place several hundred years into the future. And one thing with doing a TV show, when you're doing science fiction, although this had certainly for television a very reasonable budget, you're still making 10 hours of film, and because of that, it actually makes more sense to spend money up front on building extensive sets and being able to shoot as much as possible in camera. We did a tremendous amount of testing with video projectors and lasers and new LED lights and stuff like that to try and make visual effects in camera practically, where today a lot of times you'd probably, certainly in a studio film, most of those things would have been visual effects added in post-production. But when you have to finish 10 hours of filmmaking, it just, both from a scheduling perspective, like in terms of finishing that post on time, but also from a budget perspective, obviously, and not having to have every single frame be a visual effects, it makes sense to try and do as much practically in camera as possible. And it's a lot more fun to shoot it that way also. We shot very little on green screen, even though this is like a futuristic world in the and city. So instead it was large scale set construction, and we even had a city street that was 400 feet long and 50 feet tall, complete with restaurants on both sides and stuff like that that we could shoot on, and then translights at the end on each end, so you could literally spin 360 degrees around with the camera and be able to shoot everything practically. This is Daredevil, which is it was a show on Netflix, and can I say it's before you sign on to do a TV show about a superhero that only works at night, it's good to think twice, because that means you'll be working only night as well. I was usually it would be Mondays would start at like 1 p.m. and then by the time you get to Friday, you're starting when it's already dark, and finishing late on Saturday morning. This is House of Cards, which I did the third season on. It was certainly something I was excited to become involved in. I really enjoyed the show before I got involved, and also visually, I thought it was very interesting, and it was kind of like a great opportunity to be able to work in that world a little bit. And it has some very specific rules on camera movement and things like that. But I also think that, you know, when you set very specific rules for what you're doing, it can be interesting. It's a little bit like the you know, the Dogma 95 movement, where there were all these restrictions technically on what you could do, like you weren't allowed to light, like in terms of like restrictions, like or whatever lighting, it could only be practical, or you could have a light on the camera or something like that. But having all these restrictions can also free you up, so that the areas where you are allowed to do things, then you can entirely focus on that, whether it's the performance of the actors, or if it's telling the story with the camera in a certain way or something like that. So restrictions can be a good, interesting thing as well creatively. This show Nosferatu, I only did the pilot block on, so meaning that I set it up together with the first director, and it was you know, at its core, it's kind of like a blue collar Massachusetts story that we thought was very interesting, that has this horror element to it as well.
So I'm glad you brought that up, you know, about working within these rules for these shows that have been on for, you know, multiple seasons before you joined them. But like you said, you know, you did the pilots for Nosferatu and for Blind Spot. So are you making those rules since it's the pilot, or does that come even beforehand from the initial creative team, like the showrunner and any other, you know, executive producers or, you know, those folks?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly showrunners and directors. Pilot director might have ideas going into it, but you know, I think also when they're looking to hire a cinematographer, a lot of times part of what they're looking at is someone to help them create the vision for what that show is, and it's always a dialogue for sure. I mean, I think when it comes to the hiring process, it's always a little bit interesting. And I mean, and this doesn't only apply to cinematography. I think it's just any kind of creative role that you're doing, because I think one kind of like problem with it, I find always when I interview for a project, is that, you know, you get the script, and that's pretty much usually the only kind of information you have before you go in to meet with either the director or the director and the showrunner and that kind of thing. And in a way, it's almost like you're expected to come in and present your full vision for what the project should be. And to me, I always find that I want it to be a little bit more of a back and forth. I don't want to come in and say like, oh, I see it as only being handheld, and then have everyone be like, oh, but we imagined it being very like a classic, and and you're like, so for me, it's like, you want to come in and bring in the ideas that kind of like resonate with you when you read the script, but I think you also have to be very open to kind of like see what it is that the people that are already invested in this project, what they're looking for. And to me, that is not just to get the job, but it's also the way to approach a project creatively, because I do think that it is a collaborative effort, and part of me choosing to work on a project is that I want to work on projects where I am inspired and by the director, and kind of interested in the vision that that he or she wants to present, and I want to get into the head of the director and kind of like help create that, not just from a vacuum say like, oh, this is how it should be. So, but yes, back to when you're setting up a TV show, I think that's very much the way that you do it together with the people, and maybe as a cinematographer, you'll be sort of creating more of the rules relating specifically to the visuals of it. So like I usually create some kind of look and rule book in terms of like how things will be approached, like how you approach night scenes, or how, if there's a specific methodology to the camera and how it moves and that kind of thing. And
you very nicely have you sent your rule book for The Plot Against America, which I'd love to transition to now. You know, those who are tuning in haven't seen the show yet, it's on HBO. It's a 6-part miniseries, and you were the cinematographer on all 6 episodes. It's a terrific show, and congratulations. You know, you received an Emmy nomination for this. In fact, you were the lone nomination for the series, which I was surprised to see because it is so good. Can you talk about how you got involved with the project and how you were brought on?
Yeah, sure. So the in this case, it was the pilot director that brought me on. The show only had 2 directors because it's only 6 episodes. So each director did 3 episodes. So it's more. So the first director, Minky Spyro, I had worked with before on a pilot for Hulu that didn't end up being picked up, which is always a traumatic experience because, you know, whether a show gets picked up or not, you basically have put in the same amount of work. You shot it and completed it, and if it doesn't get picked up, it's just not ever seen by anyone. And in fact, you, in my case anyway, you don't even have anything to show for. You don't even have the episode to show. So it can be a little bit traumatic, and I've been when that happens. But on the other hand, it still is a creative process. So we had worked together, and we really enjoyed it. And she brought me on to meet with everyone else who was working on the project, including the second director and David Simon, who's the creator, and the producers. So because we had a relationship from before, I felt like there was a significant amount of trust between us to where I could kind of like present a specific idea, which is kind of like what I did with this proposal. So it sort of became like the visual proposal for the show. I think by the time I was finished with the proposal, I already had the job, but I sort of started the process. I was sending them stills as we were discussing the possibility of working together and things like that. And I was talking about my ideas for how to approach it. And then as we finished, and I was on the project, it still made sense to finish the booklet to kind of have everyone have sort of like this document to refer back to in terms of like what our approach was, like for operators to look back at like framing ideas, and for the gaffer to look back at in terms of for lighting and things like that as well. So it sort of became something that was with us throughout the making of the show.
So let's show some of the photos from the show. We'll throw those up, and you can talk a little bit about the scenes, and then we'll show a few pieces from that guide that you created. Sure. Like I said, this is a great show. It's mainly set in New Jersey, and most of it was filmed in New Jersey, correct?
I think we filmed maybe roughly half in New Jersey and half in and around New York. We had sound stages at Silver Cup in Queens. And we would, you know, when we were scouting for locations, you know, it's hard to find locations that are more or less intact when you're shooting for the 1940s. So we cast a pretty wide net in terms of location searching, and but it takes place in Newark, New Jersey, and a lot of those locations are from around that area. So what you can see in this photo is kind of like one of the key concepts of what we did, which is deep focus. Much of what we see these days, and certainly much of what I've been working on lately, has been very shallow focus. You know, there's been a resurgence of large format photography, for instance, you know, with sensors that are approaching the size of 70 millimeter film. And that lends itself to very shallow focus. But I was sort of inspired by the photojournalism of the time, and what I liked in those were these kind of like compositions with depth, where you would have something in the foreground and you would have something in the background, and it would all be somewhat in focus. And I thought that was an interesting approach to go with for this. It's Rabbi Bengelsdorf, played by John Turturro. Just in a synagogue, and a movie theater, which was basically how people got their news in those days. You know, via radio, newspapers, obviously, and then the newsreels that were shown at the local theaters. So here's an example of the deep focus that I think is kind of interesting. You have these 3 characters And with all three in focus, you can sort of like look and see the body language of the different people, and sort of like the expectations of the boy. They're looking at a potential real estate property that they're thinking about moving to, and I find when you do it like this, you can sort of live in a frame a little bit longer, and let the audience decide what to look for in a way. So this is the set that we built in at Silver Cup. So it was you know, even though we built it in a studio, I really still wanted a very natural lighting approach to it. So we built it with hard ceilings, so we had to light through the windows. We had to use practicals. We even across behind that window that you can see out there, we even built a full facade of another building with windows and apartments behind those, so that on certain days we would have extras that would move around in the apartment across the way, so we could see across the window. And so we in some ways treated it very much like shooting in a practical location. And in fact, the producers who you know, they're known for shows like The Wire and Treme and things. They sort of have a philosophy of they always shoot on location. So for them, it was sort of like they had come to the realization even before I got on the project that this apartment had to be done in a studio, and there was just too much work in it, and it wasn't going to be practical to do it on a real location. But they still very much wanted it to have a very much the feel of a real location. So we worked hard to do that, and the actual location where the exterior of this house is, we finished the front of that house so that we could connect the two. So we could look out the window on the real location and have some of the furniture in the foreground and the right wallpaper and that kind of thing. And that way we connected. And we even did a few shots where someone is running down the stairs and out onto the street, and we would follow them in a Steadicam shot from this studio apartment, and then we would make a visual effects cut as they're entering the stairwell, and pick that up on location, and then follow the person running out into the street and follow them out onto the street. So we could make those kind of connections visually between it. But the showrunners, they were very, very focused on authenticity in terms of lighting and in terms of like everything, in terms of set design and the authenticity of the period and things like that. I think I was even like in some situation, I had the actors facing a mirror, and that's always a tricky situation to light, because you can't really get any film lights in, because the mirror will reveal them, and you can't really get into the eye. So I sort of had a light rigged above the mirror that was sort of providing illuminance for the faces of the actors. And I remember having the producer come in and be like, but where is this light coming from? And I had to admit that, it's an artificial source that truly isn't there in the set. But I actually thought it was a great comment that they were so strict with the authenticity of it. And I don't think I've ever had a producer before complain about putting too much light on the actors. But so it also was a good learning experience in terms of like staying true to the authenticity of that.
Well, and that's interesting. You know, this is, as you noted, a period piece, whereas a lot of the other shows you've been on have either been current or even futuristic. Did you like doing this a little bit better? Was the challenge more, did it make it more interesting?
I mean, there's certainly interesting, very many interesting aspects about it, and one being, of course, trying to create the mood and the feeling of that period. At the same time, there are many challenges as well, because if you're shooting something that's present time, modern day, you can go out and find the right locations, and you can be inspired by that location, and then and sort of like live in that space and let that help you dictate a little bit how you're shooting it. But when you're doing something that's either far in the future or far in the past, you have to design it a little bit more, because it's not there. So you have to design what you need, and sometimes you have to design only exactly what you need, limiting you a little bit when it comes time to be spontaneous on the actual shoot day. So because the 1940s is still far enough back in time that there's very little for free, more or less everything has to be dressed in some capacity in order for it to work. So, but at the same time, it's also fun working with that, within that. Yeah, so here I like this kind of deep focus thing where you can have 4 profiles all in focus, and sort of like all the different characters be a part of the story, not just telling the audience that the important guy is the guy with the newspaper and everything else is sort of a blur around it. So yeah.
I mean, the light in every photo, you can see how significant the lighting is and the choices that were made for this show. The next thing we have is the guidebook that you created. So we're just going to flip through that a little bit. You sort of have an overview on the next screen. So if you want to talk about your concept a little bit here and
yeah, so I mean, part of it is like just in terms of creating is sort of like just giving my take on what this story is. And basically I have the conversations I've had with the creatives involved in the project, and then I have a couple of the scripts, not all 6. It's very rare that you would have all scripts ready in time before you start shooting. But there's also the book. So I have the book by Philip Roth to kind of like pull on for inspiration. So that's sort of where what's kind of like starting those conversations. And so here's some of the examples of like the deep focus staging, and I think that photo on the left was, I think maybe when I saw that photo, that was probably what led me to feel like, wow, this is what I want to do. That feels really unusual and interesting, and also appropriate for what this show could be. There's kind of like a romanticism around very shallow focus at the moment, and has been for years. And I certainly enjoy that and feel like there's some real cinematic qualities to it. And in fact, the last few projects I've shot have all been large format cameras with wide open lenses, and there's a real beauty to that. But then this felt like a fresh contrast to that, that also could connect with the photography of the time in a meaningful way. So so that was kind of like the basis for that direction. And then with the lighting, so we wanted dramatic lighting. We wanted the lighting to support the story, to support the emotion in the scenes, but we always wanted it to look real and not lit. So we would make lighting choices based on what would be possible. We didn't want it to feel stylized in the lighting. We didn't want it to feel like lit close-ups or very dramatic shafts of light or something like that. We wanted it to feel real. But I would be like in this photo, I would be looking for inspirations to create this kind of like. So I would look for photography that would have interesting situations of light that would have occurred naturally, but that could be used for emotional reasons in our story. And then I would try and recreate them for certain scenes as I thought was appropriate. And then obviously a lot of the photography that I was looking at, or almost all the photography I was looking at, was black and white, but we didn't want to make a black and white show. We wanted color to be a part of it. And so we were looking for inspiration for what that would mean. And obviously color photography existed in the 40s. Ektachrome was the modern color stock of the time. So we sort of used that as a kind of inspiration, combined with I think in the end we chose a LUT, which is basically the translation of what our digital negative is, how it's going to be translated, and we based it on a film stock that I used to use a lot when I was shooting film. and that was kind of like the base for it. And we were able to, in testing, to create kind of like the color scheme and the look that we thought was appropriate, very closely to what the final look of the show is, so that everyone could see it on the monitors, editors would watch it that way, and everyone was used to it. I think one important aspect of sort of like delivering dailies that look similar to how you intend the footage to be is that everyone's going to be living with this footage for a long time, and it's easy to get used to it. So when it comes time to do the final color correct, you might find resistance if it's too drastically different from what everyone has been looking at for the last few months when they've been editing it and working on it. So yeah, so just some more samples. We didn't go exactly that direction, but it's sort of like this is some of the inspirations for it. Yeah. I don't, you know, this is something I put up. I wanted rich and vivid skin, and you know, I think one aspect that we did incorporate was this kind of like what's called ENR, which used to be an old, used to be a process for retaining the silver in the negative when you were developing, and it would create a slightly more contrasty, desaturated look that would kind of like pop highlights a little bit and make for very rich shadows. But so that was part of what inspired that decision. I don't know if the actors were really into me focusing on every single pore and wrinkle in the skin, but and then in terms of framing, we like to use the deeper focus to take advantage of that and create frames. But we would also, like, for instance, that apartment set that we would build it with doorways and windows and even interior windows and windows indoors, and mirrors and sort of like create opportunities to where we could create frames within frames and to shoot people in reflections and or broken up through glass and that kind of thing. So that kind of became a thematic thing as well. And here I just wrote some notes on like how we would build the set and how we would connect it with the exterior, like what we talked about a little bit before, that we would finish the exterior, the actual location we would finish part of as well, so we could make some of those transitions. And also on the set in the studio, we finished the walls on the outside, not just the interior walls, but the outside, so that we could look in through windows and things like that into the apartment, and that way also connected more to the real location.
So interesting. That photo looks like it could have been taken from the set. I mean, it's so similar to some of the scenes.
Yes. So we like to steal, create,
borrow.
Yes. So we had quite a few scenes shooting in cars and with dialogue and things like that. And so we had some discussions about how to do that, because in my experience, it's very tough on the actors to do it for real, in traffic, moving vehicles, perhaps the actor driving and things like that, especially when you have several pages of dialogue. And that's what we did. We had young actors that have limited hours, and especially if you have a night scene and things like that. So we had a lot of discussions, but the producers were very adamant, and we were on board with it, because, you know, I think it's also better to shoot it all practically. So for the most part, that meant that we were towing the car with a camera car that would have a crane on it, so that we could shoot the car from the crane in through the windows, find out different camera positions by moving the crane around while we were driving, obviously on real streets, but with controlled traffic and things like that. But that way we could get as much, it would be as real as possible. And then, of course, for our interior shots in the car, we would have the camera operators jump in the car and shoot while driving. Some of it with the actor driving the car, but also some of it still being towed. you know, these cars from the 40s also are not always the most reliable. So, but yeah, so there was a real focus on doing it real, as opposed to setting up in the studio with green screens and things like that.
And I have to say, this guidebook was about 40 pages long. So, you know, though we couldn't see the whole thing, I mean, it's really incredible to see how you envisioned the show and how closely the show really hewed to your initial vision. You know, and specifically, I mean, you have all sorts of interesting shots in the show, both, you know, wide crowd scenes and smaller, tighter scenes within the house. There's one specifically, you know, there's a personal favorite of mine. It was in the final episode. It's not, I will not say the spoiler, but Zoe Kazan's character is on the phone and it's shot down a hallway and you push in very slowly, and it gives such emotional heft to the scene, you know, and her performance is terrific as well. But sort of all the elements combined, you know, in that one scene makes it so devastatingly emotional, and it just beautiful work to your credit. And it's so interesting now looking at the guidebook after having seen the show and looking at your vision and seeing how you know, from the beginning you stuck to it. And I mean, you know, working on that show from start to finish, was that a more rewarding process than, you know, slipping in and doing a few episodes of a particular show but not the whole thing? Or do you have like a favorite project that you've worked on thus far in your career?
Yeah, sure. I mean, yes, I think that this was a particularly rewarding project to be involved in from start to finish, and also, you know, there's a certain, when you do the whole show, which I've done a few times, when you shoot all the episodes, there's a certain kind of like, you have some kind of creative ownership over what you've done, and you can kind of like sort of like conclude it in a way. But it's also from a personal perspective, it can be quite draining, because it's very tough when you're like this show was 106 days of continuous shooting basically. So you're basically from when you're starting, working every weekday for 106 days basically. And even though these days shoot days rarely go that much above 12 hours, the industry has gotten a lot better. It used to be that 15, 16, even longer was very normal. And these days, it seems, at least on the productions that I've been working on, it seems like 12 is has become the new normal, which, you know, even that is still a long workday in any other industry. When you add on that there's a lunch that extends that, and you might have a commute that could be an hour in each way or something like that. And then if you're working on something where you don't have time to prep everything, you might want to arrive an hour early with the director to walk through what you're going to be doing in the day and stuff like that. So in the end of it, you're away for 15, 16 hours a day during that whole period. So while creatively rewarding, it can be quite challenging on a personal level, and it's sort of like finding the balance, life-work balance in a way like that. So there's certainly some merit to doing what a lot of shows do, where you alternate cinematographers and you actually have time to prep with the director for the upcoming episodes, as opposed to when you do them all and you're sort of like just catching up with the directors during lunchtime or weekends to sort of see what's coming up next. But yeah.
So speaking about work-life balance, you know, we're in the middle of pandemic, as I noted. You've left New York to go to Singapore, and you're there with your family. Are you working on anything right now, either prepping for something, or is there a shoot that might be coming up soon, or anything that, I assume something was probably canceled, at least a shoot, you know, during the pandemic. But, you know, I'd love to hear what your current situation is.
Yeah, I mean, I was actually working on a pilot in New York when everything shut down. We hadn't started shooting yet, but we were about a week and a half away from shooting, I think, when everything shut down. You know, my wife is from Singapore, so we have family and friends here. So that's kind of like why this became a good place for us to go with the kids. And it's sort of become somewhat of a forced sabbatical, which we're just trying to make the most out of, enjoy this time with the kids and spend time with family and that kind of thing. There's, work is starting to pick up again, so there is the possibility. We feel fortunate enough to be able to be where we are right now, and we're probably staying here for a few more months before we come back. But it seems like people are testing out the waters and finding out ways of working during this pandemic. So.
Something that we've been discussing now that we've determined at SVA that we're going to go virtual in the fall, there are quite a few students who it might be easy for them to work remotely and virtually, but other students, especially those who are taking really hands-on courses, it might be more difficult for them. And we were actually like joking, but thinking about it specifically with cinematography. Let's just say they're cinematography students who are having to take a virtual class, but they don't necessarily have the equipment at home with them. How would you go about teaching cinematography in a virtual situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to take advantage of what the medium is a little bit, which I think part of it will be obviously looking at cinematography and sort of like, because I think that a big part of the work is like finding what it is that you like. Obviously you want to experiment and find ways of achieving it, but you also want to kind of like develop your taste and kind of get an idea for what it is that you like. So I think looking at cinematography and discussing the different qualities of it is still valuable, and something that's still valuable to do whether you're in a classroom or not. So that's certainly part of it. And then the other aspect that I imagine would have to be part of it is to do actual assignments, like to go out and shoot things, even if you can't do it in a class setting. I mean, one advantage is that at least equipment, even if you're shooting on a phone, you're still you're still able to go out and do something creatively and sort of create something with cinematography. Yeah, I mean, I think as all cinematographers to some extent also, learn to craft from reading things like American Cinematographer, the magazine. So some of the information is coming from a theoretical place, even if you do need at some point to have that experience of touching the actual equipment and learning, because I think ultimately the way you're going to learn is by doing it yourself. And I think this is true also when you finish school, is that although it's good to go and work on film sets and get experience seeing how it's done in a larger scale professional environment, I think ultimately in order to really develop yourself as a cinematographer, you need to be there making the decisions yourself, meaning you need to be moving that light left or right to find out whether you like it better more towards the back or more towards the front and things like that. And that can only be done when you're doing it yourself. You can't quite ever learn that by watching someone else doing it on their photography. You need to have take ownership over it and do it on however small a scale, so that you're making those decisions and kind of learning what your taste is when you're doing it.
Any sort of other advice you'd give to students, maybe not so much who are having to learn virtually right now, but any other advice to students or others who are looking to break into this industry, whether it be from a networking standpoint or anything else that you've learned throughout your career?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was when I was at SVA, I was really eager to get out and start working, and I sort of felt like I couldn't wait to get my first opportunities, and I felt extremely ready. And a friend of mine who worked at a commercial production company took me to see a producer there to kind of get an idea for okay, so this is, they make commercials, it's real, and it's like potentially I was showing my student reel at the moment and that kind of thing. And one thing that he said to me then, that at the time I was almost frustrated by, but has since really come to be true, was that really develop and value the relationships you have with your contemporary filmmakers, like meaning like your fellow students and things like that, because ultimately they're the ones you grow up together with and do things together with. Like, you know, I felt like I needed to go out and work with, like, you know, the big successful people already. But in the end, you know, what really turned out to be true was like that I would get opportunities to shoot a music video with someone who was a fellow student, and our partnership would grow from there, and then we would do another project, and then maybe that person would land at a commercial, and then I would shoot that commercial. And it's sort of like those initial relationships and sort of like was what kind of formed the beginning of my career. Absolutely. So I think it's sort of like, it's in a way, it's like when people ask about like, oh, I need to get an agent so I can get work. And it's sort of like, well, the agent is really only going to help you once your work is of a certain level already anyway. Basically, when you have a reel that someone who knows nothing about you is going to look at your reel and be like, okay, I'll work with that person. But in the beginning, it's much more about like, okay, so we get along, we like the same kind of films, we have a mutual kind of language in terms of how we're talking, and we seem, and on top of it, we're both at the beginning of our careers, meaning that we will put in 300% of the effort in order to make the project that we're working on as good as it possibly can be, and not and that is how we're going to build our relationship together and keep moving from project to project.
I think that's a great piece of advice, and we've seen that from several graduates of SVA in the film program who they've aligned with one another either as producer and director or director and cinematographer. So I'd certainly encourage that and second that as well. So I want to thank you so much for your time and for calling in from very, very far away. I'm thrilled for you for your Emmy nomination. It's so well deserved. I highly recommend the show. As I said, Plot Against America is on HBO, and I strongly encourage it. It's a one-day thing. It's 6 episodes. You can totally fly right through it in one day. I certainly did. And I can't wait to see what's next. I encourage everyone to check out Martin's website. We'll put that down in the YouTube information. And thank you again, and best of luck, and be well, Martin.
Thank you so much, Adam. Pleasure.
I'd like to welcome Vicky Penzas, a 2013 graduate of SVA's BFA Computer Art, Computer Animation, and Visual Effects program. Since graduation, Vicky has worked at the visual effects studio, The Molecule, which was actually founded by SVA alumnus Luke DiTomaso and employs many SVA alumni. At The Molecule, Vicky serves as a lead compositor, compositing supervisor, and visual effects artist. Her list of projects is very extensive, and I encourage you to check out her IMDb page, as it includes films and television shows such as The Blacklist, Zoolander 2, Bloodline, Royal Pains, Master of None, Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt, Queen Sugar, Ballers, and The Night Of. In 2020 alone, her projects can be seen in Little America on Apple TV+, Dick Johnson is Dead on Netflix, The Sinner on USA, and what we're mainly here to discuss tonight, HBO's The Plot Against America. So let's welcome Vicky. Hey, Vicky, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Good, thanks so much for being here today. I'm so thrilled to be able to say that we have an alum who's worked this extensively on so many projects. I mean, clearly everyone has seen your work, whether they know it or not. Yeah. That list is a lot longer. Like I said, if your IMDb page, and you've only been out of school about 7 years or so. Can you tell us about your SVA experience and why you decided to go into visual effects?
Sure. Actually, I was interested in going to med school when I was in high school. And then I had a really inspiring art teacher who saw promise in a lot of my hand-drawn art and encouraged me to go for more what I like, which was drawing. So I looked into going to a school like SVA. It wasn't on my radar, but I knew someone in LA who worked on sound in movies, and they suggested SVA, and I applied here, got in, and I guess it was history since.
Yeah. How was your family with that change from med school to visual effects?
My family was actually very supportive. They're confident in me and my abilities. So if that's what I wanted to do, then they're like, do it, go for it.
That's great to hear.
Yeah.
So, while you were at SVA, any stories you like to tell? Anything that really stood out to you that made it, a really great experience for you?
Um, a lot of my favorite classes at SVA, besides the computer art ones that if you apply, you have to take, was actually the electives that we can take. There was a color class that we don't really go over in computer art. It's more for like film. And then I actually took an ethics class, and a lot of those helped make me feel more well-rounded than just focusing on computer art, which was a very extensive program that I learned a lot in, but I enjoyed all my classes there. So,
And can you tell us a little bit about your thesis film in your senior year?
so I was in computer art at SVA, kind of separates a little bit for the people that focus on CG animation and 3D art, like Pixar looking things, and then the more VFX side that do what I do now. And so I was on that side, I was on the VFX side, but I partnered with someone in the CG side because we wanted to make a silly, fun film that wasn't really accomplishable in camera necessarily at the time. So while I'm a VFX artist and I'm a compositor, I did a CG film. And it's a little comedy about a man who is stuck on a deserted island, and he meets a bird who wants some of his food. So it's a cute little film that I had a really fun time making.
And so it sounds like since graduation, you really haven't done anything else, related to animation, specifically like that project. But can you tell us, I mentioned, and you just mentioned that you're a compositor. Can you tell us a little bit about what that involves?
So compositors range a lot. Most traditionally, we take the puzzle pieces that every other department in film gives. So obviously shooting the shot, we take matte paintings from a matte painter, we take CG from CG artists, and we're the ones that put it all together and hopefully make it look good. But the other side that we also do is we just work with the footage itself. So if you've ever seen like a green screen car sequence or anything, we just add the background in there, maybe add a layer of glass and reflections to make it look like the person's actually driving a car outside instead of inside of a studio. So we're the combiners. We put everything together.
And so, you've been doing this at the Molecule pretty much since graduation. Can you sort of talk about, your career since graduation and a little bit about, how you've, risen through the ranks at the Molecule and what you've worked on?
Well, I started as an intern at the Molecule, and while I was in my senior year at SVA, I started working on some independent projects, like as a freelancer, from just people I knew, people I met at SVA recommending me for something to work on. And then on graduation, Molecule offered to hire me as a freelancer, and then worked there for months. And then I requested them to hire me as staff. That's what I was most interested in VFX, or well, VFX industry itself. There's a lot of freelancers, but there's a lot of staff artists too. And it's just two different ways of working. And my preference was just to be a staff artist. So I was actually one of their first non-management position staff artists that they hired. And then I met some really talented people there. And as I was working, I got really interested in learning to be a supervisor. So one of the supervisors there became my mentor, and I like to say that he basically opened up his brain and then like dumped it in my brain. So I learned a lot from him. I picked up a lot from him, and then there was an opportunity to help supervise a show when we were really, really busy. They took a chance and gave that to me, and then I've been a supervisor since.
And what show was that?
That was Royal Pains on USA.
Yeah.
Which I actually watched a few years later, and I really liked it.
I'm sure you don't have a ton of time to binge all of the shows that you worked on. So that's great. It sounds like you really were vocal about your own advancement at the company, which sounds really good. Can you talk a little bit about being a woman in the visual effects industry, and whether there are any challenges around that or issues that have surrounded it? I mean, it sounds like I said, you've done pretty well so far.
So a lot of industries, at least that I'm aware of, are pretty male dominated, and I think VFX is one of them too. And I think the film industry itself is one of those industries that is male dominated. So it can be intimidating when you're first starting out to walk into a room, like a darkly lit room full of men just working, and there's no other women, and you're like, okay, well, I feel a little bit weird and out of place here. But I got used to it, and then we hired more women, and it's just different, especially if you're used to working with your friends that are women or just being around more women. The thing that I would say as well is that, and this is for everyone, not just women, is to, be vocal about what you want. And a lot of advice that I got from my friends or that mentor was that no one knows what you want unless you say it. So if you want to be a supervisor, but you don't tell anyone, they're not going to know. And then they might hire someone else to be a supervisor because you never said, oh yeah, by the way, I have this interest and I want to go for this. And just recently, one of my friends is looking to kind of move from one part of VFX to a different part. And that's what he said too. He's like, I just want to make it known that that's my goal. And if you guys could work with me to get there. And what I found, and within myself as well, because I am a woman, is it might be harder for us to be that vocal and to fight for what we want. But I think that's in every male dominated field, is that we just have to, suck it up and do it, or else we might be left behind or not end up reaching our goals.
Sure. And while that's, it's not the best thing in the world, I'm glad that, you're making strides. And I think that that's great advice to offer to people in the industry in general. So, I'd love to talk a little bit about the projects that you've worked on from, the list I presented and your 7 years working at the Molecule. Was there any project that really stood out to you that you really enjoyed working on, whether it was a specific project or a specific sequence that you worked on that was really memorable?
3 come to mind. One of them was The Giver. They made a movie about The Giver, which is a book I read in middle school or something. And that was when I was just a artist. And I think it presented one of the most challenging shots me personally have ever worked on. It is one where one of the actresses is wearing a wig, and it's not a very good wig. So there's like flyaways, and the bottom of her hair is all tangly, and the director or whomever decided that that needs to be fixed because it is way too distracting. And I think that was a lot of shots that we worked on were just fixing her wig. But one of them, the camera was like zooming in on her from kind of a low angle. And that's really hard to do because you have to rebuild everything. Like if her hair was this long, you have to rebuild her entire shirt to be able to cut her hair to look nice. So it was a lot. It was combining a lot of what I learned independently on like other shots into one. And it took me almost 2 weeks to do. But once I finished it, and to me, it looked flawless. It was so rewarding because, you know, to work for so long on something just by yourself and then to be able to finish it, it was one of the best feelings. And then the other shows was Royal Pains, which is the one that I started with supervising. I love Royal Pains. The molecule itself, a lot of the people that work there and have worked there for a long time love Royal Pains because they were one of the first clients that we had and we've had for a long time. Like I think for their entire 6, 7, 10 season run, we were the ones working with them, which is just great to be able to work with the same people for so long. And then the effects in there, some of them were silly, some of them were really serious, and it's always fun to be able to work on such a variety. And then most recent, well, Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt is a crazy show that has some crazy stuff in it that when I first started working on it, we don't really get, as a VFX artist, I don't get sound a lot of the times. I don't really get a script. So I had no idea what was happening. It was all of a sudden there's a robot and I was like, this is a wild show. I don't really understand. And that was kind of weird. But then I started watching the show and I was like, oh, that's why we were doing that. That makes so much sense. And it's just so fun to see a show like that and be able to work on it. And then my absolute favorite thing I've worked on so far, no offense to all the other things I worked on, is Little America. I relate to it a lot because it's about immigrants coming to America and seeing their goals come true, or you're able to see their struggles. And my family moved here from Hungary, so I'm a first-generation American too. So I related a lot to basically every episode, and to be able to work on a show that I think is important like that is also really rewarding. And then the VFX I did, each episode is different. It's about a different family or a different person. So it ranged from, you know, making trees to a boat sequence to a shark to it just you know, all over the place of VFX, and the clients were amazing, and it was just my favorite show that I worked on so far.
That's great. And as I mentioned, that show premiered earlier this year on Apple TV Plus. So I encourage everyone to check that out. And it's funny that you mentioned Kimmy Schmidt because SVA Theater is featured in one of the final episodes. They do their big premiere at the theater, and there's some other shots outside. So I kind of wonder if you or anyone at the Molecule worked on those, because they definitely put some stuff on our marquee that wasn't there in real life. So that's great. And so, you know, we're here now to talk about The Plot Against America, which, as I mentioned, is on HBO. It premiered earlier this year to great acclaim. It's a 6-part series. You know, all of the shows that we've talked about that you've worked on, none of these are big, you know, monster or alien movies. And I think when the public that those who don't know about visual effects think of visual effects, that's what we think of. We think of King Kong, think of Godzilla, but all of the shows you've named, you know, are generally like pretty much day in the life shows, and you wouldn't think that there's a lot of visual effects, but you know, they're so subtle that you know, I've heard other visual effects artists say this, but like, if you didn't notice there were visual effects in the series, then we've done our job. Do you sort of feel that way?
Yep. What we do and what I specialize in is I guess we call it invisible VFX. So the goal is that no one would ever notice that we did anything.
And so can you talk about your involvement in the plot against America, as someone at the Molecule who's, more of a supervisor, do you do anything in terms of getting the clients, or is that left up to other people? And then how is the work assigned once it gets to the studio?
So I'm not involved in acquiring clients or working out what we're going to work on, but I do bidding. So when a client is like, we have these 10 shots and this is what we want done in them, I'm the one that helps review it and give them an estimate of how much I think it would cost to and how long it would take to accomplish these. And then we work with them with their deadlines. And then if we're awarded the project, then we intake all the shots that they want. Then we put them into a shot organizing website layout. And then from there, I assess each shot for what I bid it for and then the complexity of it. So some shots, if they're easy, I might give them to a junior artist. If they are a little bit more complicated or involve a lot more pieces, then those might get split. Like one shot might go to 3 artists, one shot might go to 4, or one hard shot might go to one senior level artist. And then from there, I review the shots and then give notes if they need some adjustment, or I say that they're good and then we send them back to client and then hopefully it all works out.
And I think it's worth noting that on most pieces, whether it be a film, a television show, etc., multiple visual effects studios are working on this. And so, like you said, you sort of specialize, and I'm guessing the Molecule specializes in invisible effects in general. So, can you talk about the overall visual effects that you did for the plot against America? And I assume that these were probably done, since the show came out earlier this year, I'm guessing these were done, months or a year before that, correct?
Yeah, I think it was like last year that we worked on this.
And do you remember specifically, what you worked on the series?
So a lot of what the Molecule worked on, and I know there were a couple of other studios that also worked on it. The Plot Against America is set in, I guess, the 1930s, 1940s-ish.
40s, yeah.
So a lot of the effects that we did had to remove air conditioners or modern cars in the background, or change signs that weren't there, or something that I've had to do in a lot of shows, almost regardless of time period, is change walk, don't walk signs. They're surprisingly modern. The pictograph of the human in the hand, it used to be words, and until they got changed, I think in the maybe 90s or something. So I've actually had to do that in almost every show that is set not in in 2010 or something. So that was funny because we had to do that too. So a lot of it is just making sure that there's nothing like maybe a Starbucks cup that is going to be on someone's desk that, someone will be able to pick up and go, hey, that's not supposed to be there. That's kind of weird. Now I'm out of the show. Like now I'm no longer with these characters because I'm staring at, the modern car that just drove by in the foreground.
Or the Starbucks cup in Game of Thrones that everyone still talks about,
Yep.
So when you get the sequences from the studio, do they tell you what to fix specifically in each scene, or is it a combination of we also have to look for that rogue Starbucks cup?
So sometimes a client will ask us to go to a spotting session, which is, I'm not the one that necessarily goes to those. My producers and the VFX supervisor, if there is one on the show, goes to those things where they watch it down and they're just eagle-eyeing every corner and everything that's happening in the shot, trying to ignore the actual like acting, because then you'll get sucked into the show and you'll stop paying attention. But they're the ones sitting there going like, oh, like I just saw something at this time code, we should flag that. And then after that is when we get a list of, okay, here are the shots and here's what we want removed. And it happens actually frequently where I'm working on something and then we are reviewing it in sequence so that it actually makes sense. And then a shot that they didn't say that they thought was fine, I'll go, oh, hey, they actually did miss the same thing that we just did on that one too. And then we'll let them know. And then most of the time they give it to us to fix. But mostly it's them identifying it, and then sometimes we actually pick on it ourselves.
Do you remember, was Plot Against America a particularly difficult project to work on, or was it very similar to other projects that you and your team have done?
It was challenging because it's a period piece, so a lot of the assets we might use to replace something, you can't really use them anymore because you need a more time accurate thing to actually put there. Like, let's say if we wanted to replace something with a mailbox, like, well, then we'd need to find a 1940s mailbox and what that would look like. So it's challenging in that way, and it was challenging in the amount of work we had to do. But one of my favorite things to do is, have 20 shots where I just need to remove the cars in the background, or remove the, air conditioners on the wall, or remove, a painting that's not supposed to be there. I love kind of things that you could break down into procedural solutions and then just do that. That's my favorite thing to do. So to me, it wasn't a challenging show, but I know that, the actual work is challenging. So
do you have any preference? Like, do you like the fact that it's a period show, or are you more interested in some of the more modern pieces that you do, or even films versus TV? Do you have a preference?
I think I like TV more so than film because of the variety of stories that they can experiment with, or that the way the series can go, because then that gives me the opportunity to maybe try new things rather than a movie which has a very like set look or a set thing or a set, like, okay, this is the VFX sequence. A show could change from one season to the next and provide more variance in like what we had to do for them, which is I think exciting for me, but maybe a little bit selfish as a VFX artist. And then as for working with on a period piece versus not, I don't really think I have a preference there. I think it's really cool to be able to work on a non-modern, not film, but TV show. So I guess I have a slight preference, only because, the set design is always so impressive, and you can see costume people and how they had to do all their work too, because it's just so much more work that goes in. And that might be ignorant of me to say, but it appears to have so much more work than a more modern piece that might, be able to be just shot outside. So.
Sure. Yeah. And actually, we'll hear, in speaking with the cinematographer for the show, he talked about how some of the shots were, filmed in interior sets that were inside a studio, but the exteriors were done elsewhere. And it sounded like, a relatively complicated shoot for what was, it's 5 to 6 hour series. And yet, I'd love to see some of the shots you worked on. You very generously were able to get these for us. They're sort of before and after quick videos from sequences that you worked on at the studio. So we have 2 before and after shots. So there's 4 videos together. And in the first video, it's very quick. And you maybe alluded to some of this, but I kind of want the viewers to try to figure out from the before shot and the after shot what's changed. So if we can look at the before shot right now. So this is the before. It's just a few seconds long. This is the original shot. And I think you said this was shot in Forest Hills.
Yeah, it's actually shot right outside my front door. So this is the building across from where I live. So when I saw this in our list of stuff, I was like, wait a minute, that's my neighborhood. And I was like, I need to work on this. I need to be the one doing this work. So
that's hysterical. Clearly they sent this shot to you for a reason. So let's see the after shot. I mean, you know, unless you're an eagle eye, like, I mean, you wouldn't necessarily know. But if you want to tell everyone what the difference between before and after is.
So there's actually a couple things going on. One of the major ones that if someone flips back and forth, they'd be able to see really clearly is that we had to remove air conditioners in 1940s. I don't think they had air conditioners in every window. So all those had to be removed. They actually didn't have painting on the, I guess, not driveway, but the street. There you go. The road. Yeah. They didn't have like, you know, the big stop text and all those lines. So all those are removed. And then they actually didn't have the overarching like lamppost. You can see it in the background, like on the right side, there's like a little lamppost. But in the original, that's the one that like comes out. They didn't have that either. So we had to remove that as well.
Let's actually go back to the before shot just so people can see it again. So you can see all the air conditioners and the lamppost and the writing on the roadway towards the right of the screen.
Yep. And actually, what they did for a lot of these shots is if the actor was outside, they dressed as much as they could. So actually the lamppost halfway up is dressed, which means it's period accurate. They made it green by just like taping something on it or painting it real fast with something that's removable. So we actually had to extend their work too, because on this shot, you could see that they only dressed it like maybe 4 feet up. They didn't really go any higher because of the surrounding shots.
Sure. That's very cool. So we'll go to the next before shot. So just to give everyone a sense, you know, this is a military hospital. We're dealing with a show that's set during World War II. And I'll let people take a look. This is the Irish actor, Anthony Boyle. He plays Alvin Levin on the show, one of the supporting leads. Sorry if it's a spoiler alert, but he loses his leg. And specifically, it's the leg we should keep an eye on. Because as we pull back, we see the rest of his leg.
His little foot sticking out at the bottom.
Yeah, on the apple box. So you kind of know what to look for when we show you the after shot, but Vicky, you are going to note some other things as well when we look at the second version.
So when the camera pans by, we pan by a door, a glass door. And actually in the original, there is a very clear cameraman that the client wanted removed because you shouldn't be able to see the cameraman walking by. So they requested us to like frost the glass so that it would obscure him. And then we had to also do some paint work to make it not very clearly a camera that he's holding. And then the other thing we obviously had to do is remove his foot sticking out from the bottom of the bed because his leg is no longer there. So the apple box and his foot are now gone, and it should just be the empty floor.
So you're blaming the cinematographer for showing up in the having his cameraman show up in the glass, and he's on this Q&A with you.
Accidents happen.
Let's see if we can look at the before shot again with just looking at the glass again. I'd love to show everyone that. So we're just going to scroll and see if you can spot the cameraman. There was his leg. It's pretty, I mean, to be honest, you know, the normal viewer wouldn't necessarily notice that. They'd probably just think it was a shadow, but except maybe the socks.
Yeah, his very, very bright socks.
If you hadn't worn the socks, then you wouldn't have had to work on the shot. But
Yeah.
that's very neat. So thank you for getting us those. It's very cool to see the type of the work you did on this show. And so, you know, any other thoughts on the show? Have you watched the show yet?
I haven't had the chance to watch it yet. No.
That's okay.
It's on my
Well,
list. It's on my list.
That's okay. You know, we know that you're currently working from home during the pandemic. I mean, we're glad that you're still working. Can you talk a little bit about how you've been working during the pandemic?
So it was actually kind of weird before, I know that COVID was being reported on back in January, but it wasn't really in the United States so much yet. Around that time, my company was already working on being able to work from home for certain artists, either, you know, if they had to do something at home and it would just be easier to not have to commute in 3 hours a day or something, to be able to maybe work from home a couple times a week. So they were actually already working on the infrastructure. So I don't want to say it's lucky, because that's a little bad, but it was kind of lucky that we already started working on that. And when the work from home mandates were on the horizon, they kind of amped up the IT side of things to be able to allow our entire studio to work from home. And that happened like instantly. Like 1 week we were in the office, the next week we were all at home. So I actually remote in to a computer, not necessarily at work, but a computer that has access to our secure drives that have all our files on them. And then once I'm done, I like terminate that instance and then turn around and I'm home. So commute wise, it's great.
Yeah, and we see one of your office mates in the background.
Yep.
They're sleeping on the job right now.
Yep.
And I think one of your other office mates is next to you, but
Yeah,
hasn't yet sat on your keyboard.
Not yet.
But you know, I know we're in your workspace right now, and we can't necessarily see it because it's too complicated to turn the camera. But just tell us how many monitors are in front of you.
I actually went from having 2 monitors to now I have just one really, really big one. So
Okay.
that was a improvement that I wanted to aim for my workspace, and I ended up really liking it. So that's what I have right now. And then I have a VFX artists tend to work on, or compositors tend to work on tablets. So I have a tablet and a tablet pen, and then my, you know, keyboard, mouse, all that jazz.
Do you feel like you've been relatively motivated, or you're trying to stay on the same schedule?
Yeah, it can be hard to wake up early when you don't need to anymore to be able to commute to work when you can just walk here. But otherwise, it feels very normal for me. I like being in my apartment. I like my neighborhood. So the transition for me wasn't very hard. I consider myself a independent person and a kind of an introverted person. So this is the best thing that's ever happened to me. I love it. And I hope that actually, you know, this might inspire some changes in the VFX industry itself, hopefully for the better. But we can only hope and see.
Well, you do live in a very nice neighborhood, as we saw in the Plot Against America. So it looks lovely. So, you know, can you talk about anything that you're working on currently? I know some projects might be confidential, but even if you can't say the project, can you tell us a little bit about the work that you've been doing?
I'm not sure if I can say the name, but
Fine.
I'm working currently on I guess it would be considered a biopic. It is about a person who was alive, and you get to see her. There you go. That's a little tidbit. Her life story, and we're aiding that in VFX. We're aiding that telling, and it's another period piece, so it's set from the 50s to the 70s, kind of, because it's about
Cool.
her life. So
I like the clues. We're going to have to figure that out. Hopefully you didn't void any NDAs
nah, I don't think so. I
by
think I'm
saying
good.
that. And is there anything coming out, that you know of in the next few months, or that you've worked on that we can keep an eye out for?
I think that project is honestly the thing I've been working on the longest. Because of COVID, a lot of studios went on break. If they can't have people in their offices, it's really hard to produce a show, and it's really hard to continue shooting. So I've actually just been working on this for a really long time. So the last thing I did work on was, I think, Plot Against America and Little America, which
Got
is
it.
kind of funny.
Anything with America.
Yeah, I guess.
A little Plot Against America.
Yeah.
So, I'd love, you've already given some really sage advice, but is there anything that any other type of advice you'd like to give to students and others who are looking to pursue this type of career, especially in light of the pandemic?
I think some advice I would like to give is that for people that are currently in school, or even out of, or people just wanting to get into the industry, I would definitely suggest reaching out, maybe finding a studio that it does the thing that you have interest in doing, and talking to those people. Anytime, while it's very few and far in between, I do get messages sometimes from students, especially from SVA, because sometimes I go and speak there, or I help one of my old classmates who is a teacher, and I sub for them and all that. So sometimes I do get advice, or I do get questions that I then give advice to. And I personally love doing that. And I know that a lot of my coworkers also love giving advice. That's one thing that I really like about the VFX industry, is, including when I first started, if I went and I asked someone a question, they would stop what they're doing and they would just help me with that question, like full on dedicated, because a lot of people love what they're doing. So they want to make sure that if you have a question about it, they're going to answer it. So ask questions, and always be interested, especially if you are interested, show that you are interested. And then I guess an overarching suggestion or just commentary I have is that the VFX industry right now is a little concerning to me personally. A lot of studios, not necessarily ones I might know, maybe they're in LA, maybe they're in London, but a lot of them take advantage of their VFX artists. I'm not sure about other aspects of the industry. I'm not sure about CG. I'm not sure about those, but and my suggestion there, or even just across the board for everyone in this industry, is to make sure that we fight for what we want, and we're worth it, and people need to know that we're worth it, and they can't just make us work 16 hours a day for no reason. So I think people should just fight for it.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think we've heard that about a number of visual effects and CG studios. It's been in the news for the past few years about them really working their artists to the bone. So I think that's great that you call that out. And I think that all of the advice that you've given, including seeking advice from people, is terrific. I want to thank you so much for your time. I think your work is so cool, and I'm so glad that you've worked on all of these different shows, including plot against America. So like I said, you know, I hope people go and check out your IMDb profile and then go back and look at these shows and be like, where were the visual effects? And, you know, what could they be? Because, I mean, they're invisible.
Yep.
So thank you, Vicki, and congratulations on all your success. And I wish you health and safety. So thanks again for being here.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Thanks so much for watching. We hope you enjoyed this Q&A and hope you'll check out our other after-school special videos on the School of Visual Arts' YouTube channel. Thank you for your interest in and support of SVA and its alumni, and for your support of the arts in general. Stay safe, stay healthy, and be well.